Everyone, still with us. I know lunch is right after this one, so I'll make sure not to go too late with that. And to all of the people in the other room. So I'm going to stand, if that's all right. It's a little bit more of my style with these. So what I wanted to do here was to talk more about assessments and grading policy. Before I get into that, I do want to acknowledge the fact that pretty much everybody in this room, or at least a large majority of people here, have some experience with some type of learning management system, be it Canvas or Moodle or anything like that. So hopefully some of this isn't too scary or too different. It's almost a different flavor on something that you probably already know. The other thing I want to say is if that doesn't apply to you, chances are it applies to somebody at your table. So whereas you'll be able to grab myself, Mark, Ildi, any of us for any questions, just to make sure to start those conversations around your table. I know a lot of you have, if you have any questions, because each other is probably going to be some of your best resources that you have. Great. So I'm going to jump into these slides. I promise we won't be spending too much time on the slides here. So what we want to go over is some basic assessment functionality and having you start to build some of those, and then eventually to set up a grading policy for those. So we're going to do each of those one at a time. So the first thing is just a reminder again, docs.edX.org, it's your friend. And I will show you more about why it's your friend later as we go through these different assessment types. So I'm going to skip over some of these. So one thing that I just want to note is that different problem components, they can be used for lots of different reasons. That you don't need to think of them simply as an exam or as a homework. But they can be so many different things, anything from just knowledge checks, ungraded assignments so that people get comfortable with the material, or that you can test if people are actually knowing the material, even without grading them, or just for other practice, even for surveying purposes at times. And so what I'm going to do is we have some what we call common assessment types or problems types. I'm going to go through actually demonstrating some of those. So just zoom in real quick. And what we're going to do, and feel free to follow along in your own course. You don't have to, though, because we'll be doing this a little bit later, is I'm going to go ahead and add in a new assessment type. So I'm going to create just a new section, just so it's easier to clean up later. I'm just going to say delete me. And here, going to create a new unit. Again.
Why is this a year old, what you just made?
What's that?
Delete me is from a year ago. What?
Oh, so if you notice some of the dates on there, that was the date that the content was released. We'll be covering that.
You were adding something just now.
Yes, and so that has, so the question for the people in the other room as well is that if we were to go back, in fact, I don't even need to go back. You can see some of it here, where it will say that this was released in June 2015. And the question is, well, that was a long time ago. Why does it say that? And the reason is because when this section was published, we published it back then. When we say published, that means that it was made available to the students, that students could actually see what was there. And since as a larger section that was published, what we're doing is we're adding in another unit inside of there. Now, students won't be able to see this one again unless I hit the publish button. Yeah, and then they'll see it because the publish date or the release date was in the past. So just for that. Also, don't worry if you don't see an advance button when you create a new unit. That's something that we'll get to a little bit later. So I'm going to go to problem types here. So we've already added an HTML type in the past. And here what you'll see is what we call just common problem types. And we call it that because if you look at it, a lot of these are going to be pretty familiar to you. We do have some other advanced problem types. I really encourage everybody to experiment with those. But for right now, what I want to do is not just a multiple choice. I want to make sure that we can have a multiple choice with hints and with feedback. So we're going to create one of those problems. And while that's doing that, what you'll see after I click that is what we have here is an outline that's actually showing an example. The reason why we have that is that you don't need to reinvent the wheel each time you're creating a problem. You can see how a problem's already been created, and you can just edit the parts in there. Because there'll be some certain syntax in here. For instance, for the different hints, we have those double curly brackets on either side. If you don't remember that, that's all right. You can just follow the example here, take out the text you don't want, put in the text you want. The other thing I want to bring up is what I'm going to do now is go to docs.edx.org. And again, this is the site that I keep saying is your friend. I will keep repeating that. We spend a lot of time making sure every single component we have is well documented. It's pretty text heavy. There's not as many screenshots or videos. We know and acknowledge that. There's some version control reasons for that, but it will have what you need there. So in this case, I'm going to go to building and running a course because that's what I intend to do right now. And if we zoom in, what we're also doing, we can do two things. So one is we could just search for multiple choice with hints and feedback, and that will show up. And also what we can do is creating exercises and tools of what we're doing here. And if you look at the list on this side, and if you were here yesterday morning, this list would look pretty familiar. This is the list that I put up on the slide saying you don't need to read it all, but we have all these components. Well, for each of those components, we have documentation for each one of them. So I won't follow each of them exactly here, but let me go for actually the multiple choice. And if I got that right, that's where we should have using hints and feedbacks in a multiple choice problem. Again, not going to read the documentation to you out loud. You can do that here. I know I'm scrolling around. The point of this is to say for each of these, if you're ever worried about how do you create something, it will be here. Sorry, it's still going to be in a backwards language for now, which will be English, but we appreciate your patience with that. So that's the last I'll be going through the docs here. But for right now, what we could do is we could just edit any of these. And so actually, I won't even do that here. I'm just going to hit save. And what we can do is I'm going to publish this so that it is visible to our question earlier. And then once that's published, I'm going to view it just to show you what it looks like from a student's perspective, because that's often something that you want to do along the way to keep this testing. Sorry, running into obviously the same internet issues that everybody here is.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you use images and not text for the multiple choice answers?
Yeah, so the question is for the other folks if you can use images instead of text. The answer is yes, but there's varying degrees of difficulty for adding those in. So for some of these more basic problem types, it's not as easy to necessarily add it in right now. The reason being is that if you look at the syntax here, or the way that this is written, it's written in a way that our learning management system can understand that it's a problem component and that it's being specifically created as a problem. And so adding in some of those image tags is difficult with this very clear format. There's something, I won't do it right now, and it will give you a strong warning sign if you click this advanced editor, which will it'll give you a strong warning sign because once you go advanced, you can't really go back with that one particular component. But in there, then you'll be able to add images, and our documentation will show you how. So it's entirely possible. So what I want to do real quick is, which of the following is a vegetable? I'm going to click hint for one of these. And if we see here, sorry, I'm going to zoom in. One of our hints is the fruit is fertilized. So if we wanted to go here, we can see, okay, well, this must be the hint section then. This is the type of syntax that we use for hints with those two straight brackets on either side. Similarly, if I were to click apple and to click check, it will give me incorrect, and it will show a little bit of text here about why that is an incorrect answer. And again, we can just go back to our problem. We can see why that's there. So hopefully I'm saying a bunch of stuff where you're thinking in your heads, yeah, that's obvious why you're showing it to me, but still want to make sure everybody gets that. And actually what we'll do right now is give you probably 5-10 minutes if you want to try to add one of these problem types to your course right now. So if you want to go ahead and do that, feel free to be experimental if you want, try other different assessment types, but try and go in there and try and customize at least one question inside of your course right now. And again, just raise your hands if you have any questions.
X marks the correct answer?
Correct. So the question was, does the X mark the correct answer? And in this case, yes, that's true. So if I were to change this, we can make this an incorrect exam and say that apple is a vegetable. If I were to save that, publish that, then I'm going to refresh this page again. And actually, I need just because it cached my old answer, I'm just going to check. And now suddenly it's the right one because we changed where that X was. Yeah. Again, there's a lot that I'm not saying here, and that's almost on purpose because I really want you guys to try this out and possibly mess it up a few times, and then you'll get a better idea of what works and what doesn't. So spend some time, add some questions. Once it looks like we have a majority of people that have done that, then we'll move on to the next section.
Trying to insert here.
Yes.
Forget about right to left.
Yeah.
Just change text. So, and because of those brackets.
Yeah. That's why we need right to work on that. And that's what we're working on. Actually, fun fact is that right to left actually has been working on open text for a couple of years now because of your neighbors.
So what's the issue?
It doesn't work.
It's implementing it in this case. It's going to be one explanation. Or if you haven't, I just want to get a sense for timing. Okay, we'll give it another few minutes. If they're finishing up their questions or other things, and going to move on to some other components. So, is everyone good? I'm going to take quieting down as a good. Okay. Here, I'll put this another way, which is that the longer we go for this side, then the longer we wait for lunch. I know food is motivator. Okay. That helped a little bit. So what I wanted to do now, just to move on, is if we're looking at our problem component, so we've built a problem at this point. So we have whatever different type of problem type you want it. What we're going to do now is to go to settings. So before, when I was saying that a problem isn't necessarily for an exam, it could be for just a knowledge check, it can be for any other types or a survey, lots of different things that you might use a problem for. It's really in the settings where you can help modify a lot of that. So there's going to be basics just for the display name if you want to say what this was. So I could just say quiz 1. But some other interesting information here is, for instance, is maximum attempts. So you can imagine if this is an exam, you might want it to be 1 or 2, depending on how harsh of a teacher you want to be for people. But if it's just a knowledge check in between videos, then you might just want to keep that empty. Let people try it out as many times as they can. Also, if it is a quiz, in some case, you might want to add some sort of problem weighting. We'll actually use this as a transition to talk about grading in a minute, which is to say if you had lots of different questions, let's say in one exam, you may know that some of the questions are going to be tougher than others, and so you may want to associate more weighting for this. Weighting, we just do this in terms of number of points. It's all going to be done mathematically later on. What I mean by that is everything's going to be proportionate. So I could write 1,000 here. If it's the only question, then it doesn't really matter in the exam. But if we had one question that's 1,000 and another question that's 500, then the one that's 500 is going to carry half as much weight when the actual grade is calculated. There's also here, when you want to show your answer, I won't walk through all of these options, but again, just to think, if this is just a knowledge check, what would you do? Would you allow them to skip answering the question and always show what the answer is if they ask? Or if it's an exam and you want to make sure that it's only past the due date because you're worried about cheating or something like that, then you could just say once it's past due. And then that's the only time that people can see the right answer. So you have your choices here. You can even have a timer again if you're worried about cheating or somebody trying to just brute force the answers depending on your assessment. So there's lots of different options that you have. And really this is where a multiple choice question is not just a multiple choice question. Then you add in these different flavors, and it's great in the sense of what the different power that gives you then. Especially if any of you are instructional designers in here, you can do lots of cool things with this. But it requires a lot of thought depending on how you're designing your course. So just something to think about when you're doing your design. So just going to click Save here. I'll publish that. Then we're going to jump ahead and we're going to talk a little more about, assuming this loads all right, the grading policy for your course. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides. They'll be available for you in that testing course, which Ildi showed you earlier. But just to say that at a bare minimum, we have a pass-fail policy within your course. So that's at a minimum, but you can customize this quite heavily. And actually, I'm going to escape here. Sorry, of the school of thought that showing a demo is often far more powerful sometimes. So what I'm going to do is go to settings. Just when you're looking up here, one way to think about it is content is anything that a learner is really going to see. As it says, content. Settings is going to be any of your actual configuration for the course itself. In this case, I'm not going to go through all these in details, but schedule in detail, there was a question of, well, how can I change the image that you see in your dashboard for a course? You can do that, for instance, in schedule in details. Grading will go into who has access to your course. If you want to give any external people access as staff, you can do that. And then we talked a little bit about cohorts at some point too. You can do that in here. We won't have time to go through all the functionality, but yes, you guessed it, it's in the docs. If you want to find it, it will be there. It'll walk you through it. That said, let's move on to grading. And it's in this area here that we are going to set a grading policy. So if you look at this course, right now that's just set for a pass-fail. And really you can set that fail mark wherever you want. What I'm doing now is just scrolling around. Or if we want to be a little bit more powerful than that, we can add in more grades. Maybe we can remove some of those grades. And we can customize these in different ways too. So however you want to call it. And that's going to show up in the students' dashboards, and where you can get some analytics later on to see how a student did. This may be less applicable for courses on the national platform, but for those of you that may be creating courses for a worldwide audience, sometimes deadlines are hard because if you say, 12 o'clock Israel time, people may not do the math. So you can even add in grace periods to say, even though you have a published deadline, how much further do you actually want the deadline to be? And that's not published, so people can't see that. It's, again, how hard or strict of a teacher you want to be. But then here's where we get to the different assessment types. And this is where we actually create what the assignments are. So in this case, this is where you can edit. You'll see defaults when you go into your new courses that you created yourself. But in here, we can just say, we want this to be homeworks, for instance. And abbreviations, don't worry too much about that. That will show up on the student progress page, which I'll show you in a minute. But you can see how much of the student's final grade is going to count towards homeworks. And in this case, we can say, actually, that should just be 20% of their final grade. You can say how many homeworks you want them to put in, 5 in this case. And this is another one of how generous of a teacher do you want to be? Do you want to make it if they got bad grade on one homework that you'll drop that one? You'll only count the 4 highest scores. So let's say if you only want to drop 1, so you count those 4 highest, you do that. So it's pretty powerful. This is just something that you'll want to double check as you go along. And something that Ildi talked a little bit about yesterday with backwards design for a course. It's often good to think about what type of assessments you want at the very beginning of a course, and then how those grades might be reflected at the beginning, and then you can build your content around that. So you're building around those outcomes that you want it from your course. So that's more of a best practice design. So
what happens if you miscalculate the math? Like now you change the 28 from 15, you have 105%. So does it make up the difference?
well, the math, it's mainly going to count here. So it's not necessarily each of these assignments are 20%, but rather as a total, they're 20%. But either way, yeah, the total doesn't add up now because I changed that from 50 to there. But what you'll notice is that I can still save this, and it's not going to get really upset at me. There's not going to be an error message here because it doesn't add up to 100. So best practice, just to make sense of things, is to have it add up to 100. The reason, and people are laughing, is like, yeah, of course. But there's why we don't force that necessarily is that we've seen some people add assignments midway through their course where they wanted to have those count as extra credit for some reason or another. And so then the total percentage that they want to calculate it out of, that they want to maybe move that up or down. It gets a little bit funny, but it's good to work out the math probably outside of this platform, but there's a reason for that. But yes, we'd want there. Cool. So now that we set this here, I set a new type that's called homework. What I'm going to do is go back to my course outline. Just so you know, there's 2 ways you can do that. You can click content and then outline. So it's a little bit funny because my screen's compressed. Or you can click, oh, it's internet problems. Or you can click up here, which will be the name of the course. As it looks like the internet's a bit unhappy with my computer. We'll see if that works. Thanks for bearing with me. So ultimately what we're going to try to do here is to then make one of the assignments grade it. While that's loading, I'm just going to quickly go back to the slides. There's a lot to take in on some of these slides, so I'd recommend reading them probably at a separate time. But what we have here is just some example grading policies that shows you the breakdown. So when we went through all of those different settings, what that might actually look like at the very end when you're calculating the grades for your course. So this slide I think is particularly helpful. And then, sorry, this slide as well, just in case you were wondering of how it breaks down. So at a very high level, so for instance, we had that homework assignment. Let's say we set that as 50%, and we had 2 different assignments for that. What you can see is just the breakdown all the way down to the individual problem where we were setting the points for it before. Again, it's one of those things where some people will get this right away, some will take a little bit longer, but I'd recommend looking at the reference materials that we've provided. Both this and the docs will help with that.
It seems an awful lot of thought has been put into the grading structure, which is fine. I have no objection whatsoever, but considering the percentage of people who seem to finish these courses, is it worth it?
So the question, to repeat it for the other room, is that there's a lot of thought put into the grading structure, but that with MOOCs, there's a lot of early press, if you guys aren't familiar with it, where some of the completion rates are closer to 5%, especially when you have courses with tens of thousands of people. So is it worth it? And to me, the answer is still yes, because it definitely means something to those 5% of people for some of those massive courses that do that. And some of our courses have much higher completion rates. It matters to them. And also the fact that some of those early courses have a low completion rate isn't because, it's in part because some people drop out. Just you see that naturally over time. More or less and less people will take the course, just a time commitment issue. But it's also because some people are failing the courses. And they're failing the courses because you set a grading policy that reflects the bar that you think people should have knowledge for. the one other thing to note is that especially obviously if you're running this in a blended classroom environment, then the grading policy is extra important. Hopefully that helped answer it a little. There may be a larger philosophical discussion there as well about grades, but that might be a lunchtime one. Great, so what I'm going to do is, so if you remember, it's this aptly named delete me section where we added that assessment before. So what I'm going to do now is make that a graded assignment. So what I did, actually just to go back, is I clicked this little gear, which was just to configure. So I'm going to do that. And this is where you can set some other information. So when is this assessment going to be available for people? When is that assessment due? If you even want a due date. If it's a self-paced type of course, you may not want a due date. And you can say if you want this to be graded. So unfortunately, there's a save error before, but I'm going to save this as a sample question. And I'm going to save it. Oop. So hopefully the internet will cooperate and it will save nicely. But once that saves, what we can do is I'm going to go back here. And if you notice, this just said delete me. I'm going to refresh this page. And again, we will hope that the internet gods are kind and it will refresh. But once that does, then you'll see where it is marked as a graded assignment. So being conscious of time here. So while that's loading, you'll need to trust me, this will at least show up here by the time you get back or sometime soon, where that's then going to be marked as a graded assignment. So I'd encourage everybody to try this out in your own courses. At least try to make some edits to the grading policy, maybe try to associate a grade to your course. LD is going to show you some functionality later where the grading can also matter, and the grading policy can also matter if you wanted to gate content. What I mean by that is if you wanted to make it so people could only see week two content after they've successfully completed week 1. And that goes back to this concept of mastery learning, where if you want to enforce that, then it's important to set these grading policies here. So again, I encourage everybody to try this out, but it's your choice whether or not you want to try that out with an empty stomach or a full stomach, because it's right at 1 o'clock right now. So I believe, looking at the schedule, someone correct me if I'm wrong, how long did we have for a break?
1 hour.
Is fair? Okay. Okay, since I know that we'll probably be working a little bit, hopefully people won't find this phrase rude, but a little bit on Israeli time, let's aim to be back at 1:45 back here. That's all right?